The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
It is 6 minutes after 8 now. Once again, we welcome you to the Forum at 8 here on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. This morning, of course, we're looking at the election of Dr Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma to the AU's top post. She is the chairperson of the African Union Commission this morning. A lot of correspondence that has come through from you. I'll introduce my guest to you in a minute, but let me read you some of the emails and SMSs that have reached us so far here on the program. There is one from Howard P. Manyonga who says, whereas I'm happy that Dr. DZ has won, the breaking into song of the delegation as heard on radio reveals a worrying triumphalist trait that does little to keep those who supported the candidate who lost on the other side. We have seen the destructive consequences of this unfortunate form of public triumphalism within the ANC and do hope that the good doctor will desist from the temptation to export, perhaps perpetuate the politics of exclusion that threaten the emergence of South Africa, SADC, and indeed the African continent. I think the election of Dr. DZ is a crucial diplomatic victory of a deserving candidate, and as such, the celebrations should be muted to avoid sending signals that may be misconstrued for the undiplomatic winner-takes-all culture that is threatening to rip the party of Tambo, Sisulu, Mandela, and all their forerunners, others who sacrificed all to build what, until recent times, has been a formidable political movement that has been shining a shining study of inclusivity. That's Howard P. Manyonga on email. A lot of others, but let me just quickly introduce now on the line. I think from Cairo is Dr. Jackie Cilia. He's Executive Director of the Institute for Security Studies. A very good morning to you, Doc. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Xolani, and to your listeners.
Thanks, I'll look at other emails in a minute, but there's this one about triumphalism and the celebration, and it's not the first time that I'm hearing people concerned about this. Even the first time, people were concerned about how South Africa reacts to winning the first time when she won I think it was the first round or so, there was celebration as well, and people are concerned about that. What do you think?
Xolani, that first celebration that happened in January 2010, I was there in Addis as well when that happened. That was misrepresented in the media. What actually happened is that when Mrs. Zuma came out, having at that point lost by a narrow margin to Mr. Ping, who then thereafter could not get a 2/3 majority, there was an expression of sympathy for Mrs. Zuma, and women particularly were dancing and singing. That was afterwards represented, I would almost say misrepresented by Durko, as a dancing in celebration of the so-called fact that Mr. Ping could not get 2/3. So I think there was a bit of misrepresentation. Having said that, South Africa did conduct a little bit of a personalized campaign that I think unnecessarily tarnished the reputation and the legacy of Mr. Jean Ping, who was quite a good chairperson of the African Union. And that has left a bit of a sour taste, but I think these divisions will be healed quite quickly. Mrs. Dlamini Zuma has got a strong reputation. She's a strong leader. She's certainly an asset to the African Union. And I think she will quickly get beyond those divisions, which may at the moment be a little bit raw.
It's quite interesting you say that Jean Ping was quite a good chairman, because I a little earlier on the program spoke to Minister Maite Nkwana-Mashabane, and I asked her about what's likely to change. This is what she said to me. She said what should change is there will be more accountability, there will be more implementation of decision taken by heads of state, and more time of implementation of resolutions than just creating more and more. She says we'll start our proceedings in time, that we need to strengthen our early warning mechanisms. The implication then is that perhaps this was not done under Jean Ping.
All those issues that you've mentioned, I would almost say everybody is aware of that. The Africa, there was even sort of jokingly reference made to the fact that the one resolution that the AU should take is a resolution not to take any further resolutions. Mrs. Dlamini Zuma has got a reputation as a manager who managed the then Department of Foreign Affairs and subsequently DIRCO and now the Department of Home Affairs very efficiently. And there's no doubt that she would bring significant capabilities to the African Union as a strong administrator, as somebody who understands African politics, and somebody who follows a collective leadership. So she will certainly be able to build. She also has a strong deputy, Erastus Mwensha, the Kenyan, who has been re-elected. So she will improve on, I think, an African Union Commission that, in my view, has already embarked on some steps in that direction. South Africa has not only been concerned about accountability within the Commission, however, but also about the extent to which the Africa's voice internationally maybe is not as strong as South Africa would have liked this to have been. And we have quoted the examples, particularly of Libya, but also of Cote d'Ivoire, and on that issue. That's maybe a separate issue to also discuss.
I saw your tweet last night. You were tweeting about this, and you said it's the best possible outcome.
Yes.
Why?
It is, without any doubt. The African Union has been in limbo for the last 6 months. Mr. Jean Ting in the January 2011 elections could not get a two-thirds majority. Therefore, it was limping on under, let's call it interim leadership. And with a clear victory, we have certainty. There's a quality leader that has been brought into the African Union, somebody that is admired and respected across the continent. And it means that the election of the other 9 commissioners, there are 10 commissioners in the African Union, can proceed. The alternative to this would have been some other type of interim arrangement for another 6 months. So there is clarity, there's certainty, there's leadership. I think this is the best outcome that we could have hoped for given the current circumstances.
All right, I'll come back to you in a second, Dr. Cilia, about some of the things that happened there. But let me just also introduce my other guest, Dr. Chris Landsberg. He is the head of politics at UJ. As always, nice talking to you, Dr. Landsberg.
Thanks for having me again.
Thank you very much. Firstly, we spoke to you. I spoke to you sometime last week, and the Friday. The issue that's been coming up over and again is the issue of the divisions across the continent. I'm just wondering whether that issue was actually overstated, given the ultimate outcome. Then, I mean, the minister got about 37 votes. Perhaps the issue of divisions was overstated.
No, I don't think it was overstated. The minister got 37 votes after the fourth round. If the continent was as unified as we now make it after the fact, in hindsight, then it would have been a different story. The reality is, Yaki Saliers is absolutely spot on. We now know at least where we stand, but I don't think this gives clarity to South Africa's foreign policy. South Africa's foreign policy faces a number of challenges, and of course, even if Dr. Zuma were not going to get the position, South Africa's foreign policy in the continent would still have faced a lot of challenges. It was very interesting, a comment I saw on television by Lindiwe Zulu in the presidency, who I must say is increasingly behaving like a very active foreign policy actor with a lot of clout in foreign policy circles. She said, and I'm trying to remember verbatim, she said, Dr. Zuma won, we got what we wanted, now we have to go on with the business of building unity in the continent. Yeah. Now, you can interpret that last statement in many ways, but one interpretation certainly is that they recognize that there are divisions in the continent. It would be interesting, just briefly, and then I'll give others a chance, it would be interesting to see that of the 18 or so countries who did not vote for South Africa, who are some of those countries, and whether, for example, to take 2 very obvious cases where, that you and I spoke about on Friday, whether Nigeria and others and Ethiopia are there, and even if they are not there, the executive secretary of the commission will now have to work with them. She takes a cues from heads of states. It's not going to be smooth sailing, but one thing we do know, she is going to give this organization a desperately needed push and because it is needed in our continent.
All right, let me go back then to Dr. Cilia on that, because I just want to know from Dr. Cilia whether from the voting pattern, can we read anything? For instance, can we find out whether or not there are less divisions than what we thought, and whether or not the Southern African countries' diplomacy in the end triumphed?
Yes, I think, firstly, our information is that, and I'm quite sure of this, that all the other larger African countries, let's call them contenders for leadership in the continent, voted against South Africa, with the particularly Nigeria and Ethiopia. We're uncertain about Egypt, and we're uncertain about Algeria.
Okay. So we're uncertain, about Algeria, but what about Kenya?
Kenya certainly in the beginning voted against South Africa. Kenya, there's an unspoken or there's an unwritten rule that says that if the chair is an Anglophone, then the deputy should be a Francophone, and the other way around. Now, what we have now is we have Anglophones in charge of the AU that are both the chair is an Anglophone and the deputy is an Anglophone. That's quite unprecedented, and that is a new development. But the deputy, Mr. Mwensha, the Kenyan, he was the only candidate for the deputy. So what in actual fact happened is that after the first 3 rounds, which is Mrs. Dlamini Zuma won every round with a bit of a larger majority. Then after the 3rd round, Mr. Ping had to stand back, and a number of African countries then stood forward and voted for Mrs. Dlamini Zuma. Basically, heads of state just wanted a decision. They wanted to bring this a transitionary arrangement to conclusion. And Mrs. Dlamini Zuma is a sterling candidate. I mean, she's got a tremendous reputation. It is simply these division issues that I think are there, but they are more around the leadership on the continent than perhaps the stark divisions, Anglophone, Francophone, that South Africa has emphasized quite a bit.
Dr. Landsberg is bringing something interesting here, Dr. Cilia, because he's bringing the element of South African foreign policy. Should it be brought in this discussion at all? Because it's interesting hearing what Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma said. She said, look, this has got nothing to do with South Africa. South Africa won't be moving to Addis. I will be moving to Addis. To what extent, then, does this affect South African foreign policy?
Well, I would agree with Chris. South African foreign policy does face a bit of an identity crisis. And there is a lack of clarity. But as you say, that is perhaps a separate issue. She is now the chair of the Africa Union, and she represents Africa. Africa is hugely divided on a number of issues. We can mention Libya, we can mention the International Criminal Court, we can mention what to do with regard to Mali, Guinea-Bissau, how to deal with the Eastern DRC, Somalia, so on and so forth. And managing these divisions on the continent is quite difficult. South Africa was very critical of Mr. Jean Ping, saying that he did not present a strong enough voice on some issues, particularly Libya. But I think Mrs. Dlamini Zuma will find that it's quite difficult, that your space to take a particular stance is quite limited. She is, at the end of the day now, the senior civil servant of Africa. And I use the term civil servant. She's not the president of Africa. She must listen and reflect the views of Africa, and those views are often quite contradictory and requires quite a fine balancing act.
That's interesting. Coming back to you then, Dr. Landsberg, what will change? And I'm going to ask this question again because, as ordinary Africans, we want to know whether, things will change. And if they will, what exactly will change?
Look, Xolani, let me just build on to what Yaki is saying, because I think, there's a degree of commonality and consensus that is emerging here. Let's first say that, and let's put it absolutely bluntly, one of the reasons why foreign actors can do in the continent as they did, let's say, vis-a-vis Libya, in other words, muster the support of 3 countries on the Security Council, when it wasn't clear when those countries got a mandate from the continent, and who is this continent that we're talking about, who is supposed to give them this mandate and so on, is that we face an institutional crisis in the continent of Africa. Hello?
All right, yeah, go ahead. I think we may have
lost
Dr. Cilia.
Crisis in the continent of Africa. We have said consistently, Xolani, in the 4 or 5 or 6 that you've had with interviews that you've had with several of us, that she will actually bring that clarity. Yaki Elias will tell you that one of the most important summits we've had in this continent was the 2007 one, where one of the outcomes was this high-level report that did an audit of the state of the continent institutions. Even if Dr. Zuma just takes that and runs with that program, she would be doing well. But let me come to the question of South Africa's foreign policy. And of course, in the end, Jean Ping appeared to have shot himself in the foot by raising these issues, but he had a lot of criticisms against South Africa's foreign policy, including our Libya vote. Let it first be said that SADC has done a sterling job in diplomacy here. So whether Dr. Zuma or somebody else, just like in 2007, SADC seemed to have been the country that went there with a unanimous vote as to who that candidate is. The first question to me, what does this mean for Zimbabwe? What does South Africa owe Zimbabwe in return for the loyalty that they've shown South Africa right now? Remember, as we speak, all the parties to the Zimbabwe conflict or to the unity government don't complain about a lack of opposition on the part of South Africa, but they simply say to South Africa, make time for us. You are the official envoy you're supposed to. Okay. One last point I will say this to you. What I find so ironic about Dr. Dlamini Zuma's victory is that we now have a South African in the most senior civil servant position, and I like the way Yaki put it. It's almost, as I said to you in filing, this is the equivalent of a COO position in an organization. We now have a South African in that position. We host the NEPAD Secretariat. We host the APRM Secretariat. And of course, we are not only hosting the PAP, the Pan-African Parliament, but we are actually constructing a building to that effect. Here's the irony. We can't find South Africans to fill our quotas in the secretariats of these organizations. So we seem to be very good at the high politics, the high end of the politics, the heads of state's diplomacy and the diplomacy between ministers, but we seem to be very poor at finding the civil servants to go into Africa and to serve not only this country's interests, but the interests of Africa in the continent. That, for me, is a major contradiction in our foreign policy.
All right, I'll open the lines here on 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. Let's see what South Africans have got to say about this. But let me just read this email quickly. It says, I respect Dr. Landsberg's views, but his views are not a true reflection of the state of affairs on the ground. The media and SABC have been reporting on non-existent divisions. There was a competition like in any democracy. This doesn't mean division. Dr. Zuma has a record backing his suitability. I'll come back to you, Dr. Landsberg, to respond to this. But let me go to Dr. Cilia and say, was there division or not? Or is this just a matter of competition? In a competition, you have different people, different statements are made, but afterwards, kiss and goodbye, and everybody hugs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. This was simply a hotly debated competition, hot competition. I'm sorry, and South Africa won. There was a bit of discomfort about the fact that we had personalized the campaign, but she and Dirko triumphed and the presidency. And once you take your hats off to them, we thought that our analysis was that she this time around would win the first round, but she won with one or two more votes than we expected. And that created a momentum, and the general sense in Addis was not that she would win this round. There was a sense that South Africa was much stronger, and that Mr. Ping was a bit on a back foot. But that's exactly what happened. A competition, South Africa won, and what will now happen is there will now be a process of reconciliation, healing. She will reach out, as undoubtedly she will do, and Africa will move forward. There will be concerns about our competitors on the continent, but this is, from a foreign policy perspective, a huge victory for South Africa. She doesn't represent South Africa, make no mistake, but it shows the gravitas, the power in a certain sense, that South Africa can go against almost all the major competitors on the continent and get its candidate elected.
There's also Sanusha Naidu, a political analyst on the line. Sanusha, good morning to you.
Good morning, Kulani.
You've been watching and monitoring this from here in South Africa together with us, and your thoughts at the moment?
Well, I think both in terms of what Dr. Cilia and Professor Landsberg have said, have been really interesting debates around division in the competition. I think what has been very, very interesting around this is the way in which the build-up towards this hotly contested race was actually being played out in the media, and the question was, will she get it, won't she get it, and whether or not were we punching above our weight, we are one of the bigger powers in the continent, etc. And I think it's interesting that when the first vote happened yesterday, and she won that round by 27 to 24 to Mr. Ping, it's interesting the momentum began to build up quite significantly, and then in subsequent rounds she started to quite easily eat into the electoral base of Mr. Ping until she actually won it in the fourth round by a convincing majority. So I think it's quite interesting in terms of the number of issues that emerged there. One, I think you cannot have an African Union in limbo for 6 months, and of course the speech by the chairperson of the African Union, the president from Benin, actually pleaded with the member states to actually find a resolution and find a kind of useful resolution towards this impasse. Secondly, I think that there were interesting swing votes that we need to now calculate in terms of this. And more importantly, I think what is interesting is the fact that we have to look at and see, where these swing votes came from. But I think what's more important is that the role of SADC and how much of SADC played in the success of Mrs. Zuma as well, Dr. Zuma. Because I think that when we look at this victory, we must look at it not necessarily only about South African diplomacy, but we must look at it in terms of the investment that the SADC region and put into this in terms of the whole lobby in the last 6 months towards Mrs. Zuma's victory.
All right, let me read some SMS's emails and take some more views here. There is Lucky Mashele in Matsakali village who says, the new AU chairperson and Minister Zuma is a great workaholic. Congratulations to our new AU leader. Ike Kumalo, the AU seat is going to cost us dearly. Now that we killed Gaddafi, who was funding it, what about illegal immigrants here? Our borders are now open to abuse. For the first time, Home Affairs has directing, and I'm worried. I'm worried about Mrs. Zuma because South Africa agrees for the imperialists to take over South Africa. What about Africa, says another SMS. Let me look at emails. A couple of emails have come through here as well. There's one from Olani in Neisner who says, it is my hope that South Africa won't use the continent to its own advantage in order to score sole goals at the expense of other countries. Another thing is the issue of the New World Order, whereby the Vatican and USA will use this country to achieve these two-state hidden agenda. Robert Ndlela from Youth in Action in KZN says, I think it is high time for us as Africa to put our hands and heads together and start building a better Africa. Africa must never be a dumping zone of Western states, not anymore. As youth of Africa, we promise to take a center stage in this process. Congratulations to Dr Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and her team, says this email. Another email came through from Jablani in Durban. Okay, I read this one about Dr. Landsberg's views, and he's going to respond in a minute. But there was another one as well that came through from Kulego Kuna Nkomazi in Mpumalanga. I'd like to congratulate our Home Affairs Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma on her win and being elected the AU chairperson. Let's just quickly go to the lines now. We have Clayson Munyela, who speaks on behalf of the Department of DIRCO, International Relations and Cooperation. Clayson, hello.
Good morning, Polani, and good morning to your listeners.
Hi, thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, no, just a couple of things. One, I wanted to appreciate the contribution of Celius, who is here with us in Addis, the observation that this was a democratic process where there was a competition and a winner has emerged, but the leadership of the continent has been united. If you look at the numbers, and there is a common vision in terms of where Africa should go, that the leadership of this continent and the people of this continent that must drive the new vision towards stabilizing democracy and moving towards integrating our economies and a path for development. And the fact that, secondly, this issue that there's never been a situation where the chairperson and the deputy chairperson speak one language, although we don't emphasize it. When Alpha Konare was the chairperson of the commission, his deputy was from a similar linguistic group, which is Francophone. So it's absolutely not true that this is unprecedented. unprecedented, and it can't be that we elevate the issue of language above everything else that's going on the continent. Thirdly, look, for South Africa's foreign policy, this is a huge achievement if you consider the fact that we champion and put ahead of everything else the African agenda. The fact that this continent is rising at the moment, is the second fastest growing region in the world. And for South Africa, it can't be that the rest of the countries on the continent are left behind when we are developing. And therefore, the pursuit of the African agenda is key in terms of the South Africa's foreign policy, the promotion of democracy, of human rights. And for us, this is a major step. And Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma will serve all the member states of the AU equally, not one region, not one country.
Clayson Munyela, thank you very much, calling us from Addis and wanting to set the record straight in as far as a number of issues are concerned. I'll get my other guests to respond to what Clayson is saying. I'll also take more calls, 0891 104 208.
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
Thank you, Sigalelo. 25 to 9. Let's take your thoughts then on the election of Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as the first female head of the African Union Commission, which obviously last night ended a bruising leadership battle that some people say was dividing or threatening at least to divide the organization. What are your thoughts then on what happened? Let's take calls. All right, I'm going to go to the lines in a minute, but let me read some SMSs. South Africa is like the US. We want to dominate the continent. They want to control the world. Charles in Cape Town, while I congratulate Dr. Zuma, I have reservations regarding cooperation from the Francophones. Another one from Nelspruit says, congratulations, South Africa and SADC in Africa. It's Africa's time. Gavin Hammond in KZN says, reality is that Jacob Zuma is a strong influence in his leadership in Africa. Zuma for Mangawong. That's an SMS from Gavin. Another one says, congratulations to SADC and partners. All those skeptics should eat humble pie, especially Chris Maruleng of E-News Africa. That SMS is not signed. Chat in Cape Town says, what is the AU's position regarding US imperialism, AFRICOM, the war of terror, the murder of Gaddafi, and destabilization of Syria? And another one, diplomatic voting in action. Mr. Ping had already conceded throwing the towel that he will withdraw his candidacy. That sounds to be true. Wait and see. Thanks. There is also an SMS, and I'm going to ask my guest perhaps to think about this a little later on. It comes from Zola, who says, can your experts give an indication as to who is likely to replace Nkosazana in South Africa? That also is a question coming through on SMS. Let me remind you that on the line, of course, I've got Sanusha Naidu, senior researcher at the South African Foreign Policy Initiative, and I've also got Dr. Yakisilia, executive director at the Institute for Security Studies, joining us on the line. He was there. He witnessed it in Addis last night, also joined by Dr. Chris Landsberg, who is the head of politics at University of Johannesburg. My guest will respond in a minute. Let me go to Ashanti in Durban. Hello, Ashanti.
Good morning to your listeners and everyone. You know, it's a great day when Africa really gives a woman leader the chance to show the mettle. You know, we have put aside the African Renaissance agenda, but I believe that she's the kind of woman who can really and truly, and I really was disgusted when I looked at the emails, you know, and the blogging and the disrespect that people were, you know, showing towards her and always trying to find an agenda around women leadership. And that for me is very sad. So I'm really pleading that women out there, you know, we don't give energy to the negative criticisms about one of our women leader, because this could open a lot more avenues. And I know people are euphoric, you know, my brother, but it's important that we feel good about one of the key agendas, which is women in leadership on the African continent. And we're not only talking it now, we're acting on it. And that for me is the greatest part of her achievement, getting in there. So we must stop the hating and the negative stuff and just be realistic that we have a bigger plan, you know, and there are people who like to be pessimistic, and I'm glad she's handling this anglophone, francophone thing that people like to feed into. We must be very careful that we're not feeding into old speak, you know. It really is an important part of our delivery.
Ashanti in Durban, thank you very much. Let's go to Cape Town. Zubaida is there. Hello, Zubaida.
Rani.
Hi, welcome, Zubaida.
Thank you.
Yes, your thoughts, please.
I'm surprised. I'd like to ask Chris, over the last few days, I've been listening to him, and when I was listening to him, I was completely disagreeing. I cannot understand why we would not support Southern African position. Yes, there are complexities, but why wouldn't we, as South Africans and South African commentators, support the Southern African position, which in effect is going to the election of Nkosazana Zuma is going to strengthen the general position of anti-regime change attitude and all the things that we've seen in the last year or so, the entry into Libya, all of this. So why don't we say that this is in our best interest,
okay, Zubaida,
instead of emphasizing all the problems?
All right, Zubaida, thank you very much. Let me ask Chris to respond. Dr. Landsberg.
Sure. I'm glad to hear that there was at least one person who listened to me over the weekend. Thanks, Zubaida. Listen, there was another question that asked me whether I'm not over-dramatizing the divisions in the continent. So let me respond to that. During one of the programs, I made the point that it seems to me that we would have had a much smoother victory if South Africa put forward another, and I want to stress, SADC candidate, because I never disagreed with the idea that indeed it is SADC's time and SADC has a very strong footing on this issue. My issue, Zubaida, was that whether we like it or not, there is this unspoken rule. Now, we could make the case that it's time for this unspoken rule to be challenged, that the big players, the so-called Big Five, and I say so-called because it's not always clear how big they are, that they don't put themselves forward to this, for this position. Yesterday, I used the following analogy. I said most recently, Minister Pravin Gordhan was the latest Minister of the Treasury of Finance, and all his predecessors who took issue with the fact that Christine Lagarde should head up the IMF just because it's something that was decided in 1945 and they've done it. There's another unspoken rule that America should head up the World Bank, and we are vehemently opposed against that. So why is it that in Africa, we as a big country, the most industrialized country, want for us in Africa what we don't want other great powers to want for themselves in the world? This is really the point I'm making. But finally, Kolani, let me come to the question of divisions in the continent.
Yeah.
Of course, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, in her style, will reach out. She's already now pleaded and say, please, everybody supported me, and I think that includes Nigeria and Ethiopia and so on. Where I would challenge Yaki Salias and the others, it seems to me that one of the unintended consequences of what has happened here with the spectacular victory of Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is that we have now introduced out in the open something that has been under the surface in Africa for a long time, namely real politics.
Yeah.
That in future, don't be surprised if big countries now go for positions, no matter what the stakes are. So to put my position on the line, I prefer an Africa where there is what you could call a concert of powers, where great powers, those with influence in their specific regions and in the continent, could come together, agree on things, move things forward, as opposed to these big powers being at each other's throats.
Okay.
This is one of the unintended consequences.
All right, let me bring in Dr. Yakeselia, because this issue of the unspoken rule about big countries, South Africa sought to dispel that by suggesting, for instance, that Nigeria has held the position of the chair of the African Union Commission for 2 years, and that whole thing about this unwritten rule and the gentleman's agreement around this doesn't exist.
Technically, of course, South Africa is right that it is an unspoken rule. But South Africa has gone. There is no doubt that the main competitors to South Africa in Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Egypt, Senegal, did not want South Africa to have a successful election with Mrs. Dlamini Zuma. Yet we did it. This is an issue that relates around African big power competition. We managed to get beyond. We managed to succeed in our campaign, despite that unwritten understanding. That changes things. And I think our concern would be simply that what I hope we won't see is that the 10 commissioners of the African Union are now divided up between these A5 African countries, the big five African countries. That is something that I think we need to be concerned about. I don't think it will happen. South Africa's argument is exactly that what is needed is that one of these large countries should in actual fact assume leadership of the African Union. And the argument by the South Africans is that it is because we expect small countries like Gabon and others to lead the Commission that Africa's voice is not heard. And what we need is we need one of the large countries to lead Africa, and that will ensure that Africa is much more represented and its voice is heard globally. Now we'll see how that plays out, but it is a novel approach, and we are there. And I think Mrs. Dlamini Zuma will certainly adopt an inclusive, a consultative approach to Africa. She did that when she was foreign minister. She's a competent, hardworking, and an able commissioner. She is a huge asset to the African Union. There is absolutely no doubt about this. And the Commission, and I think generally Africa, will unite behind her. South Africa, ironically enough, is the country that makes more of the Anglophone-Francophone divide than it should. We have a little bee in our bonnet about French and French influence in Africa, which is a bit overstated. But I have no doubt that she will very rapidly emerge as a unifying instead of a divisive factor on the continent.
Just very interesting, because you mentioned South Africa and this whole divide about Francophone and Anglophone. I just wanted to know from you, you saw her perform at a close range, I suppose. The current minister then, Minister Maite Nkwana-Mashabane, are you still there for me, Dr. Silias? Oh, we seem to have lost that line. Because I wanted to know her role here. Perhaps Chris is going to respond to that. But before I go to Chris, let me bring in Sanusha again, because you mentioned last week that part of the question that we should be asking is practically what is going to change. Are you any clearer now, Sanusha, what is likely to change?
I think we're still in the euphoria of her victory. And there's 2 or 3 points I want to make about this big power competition, etc. I think what's interesting is that as the build-up emerged, we kind of assumed, and I think there's a point that Yaki makes which is valid, and that is we were assuming that South Africa's image, PR, etc. would definitely not win, and that South Africa probably would be punching above its weight for this position. And I think we kind of got it wrong in the media as analysts in some contexts, that we didn't anticipate what was going to happen. But I think what's also important to remember is that if we do move along this line of a rising Africa and a changing AU, then I think the question is really about, how do we actually look at the candidates? Who's the right candidate for the job? Can that candidate increase the voice of Africa, and can it implement? Because I was listening to the interview this morning by our foreign minister, and what was very interesting, she spoke about implementation and taking forward implementation of process. And I think it's important as well to see how this implementation is going to go forward. What is also very interesting around this is the question around perhaps what we're beginning to see now is a much more practical role in terms of what is implementable for the African Union and what's going to be taken forward. I think what is also very interesting in terms of this victory is how do we as South Africans react to it, but more importantly, how is the continent reacting to it? I mean, we've heard about the victory being about the African member states coming together and saying, right, we want this impasse to be resolved. But I've also been looking at Twitter and other social media outlets, and there's still some residual issues around South Africa and whether it's the right position for Mrs. Zuma, whether what has happened. So I think it's important as well to continue to look at this in a much more critical way. I think on the question you're raising around, what does it mean now? I think it's really about building bridges and going forward and actually bringing into the fold the countries that actually voted for Mrs. Zuma who had not voted in the first, second, or third round for her. And I think those are important issues to take forward in terms of how does she build those bridges, how does she move forward, and what are the issues she's going to take in terms of the practical implementation of process. I think in terms of being the chairperson of the AUC, she also has to deal with the member states and how she's going to try and build consensus amongst the member states in terms of practicality.
All right, an SMS from Ambrose here in Johannesburg. In fact, Anthony Ambrose says, Fatima Chohan for Minister of Home Affairs, beyond ND Zuma at Home Affairs, great leader, interested in people, passion for South Africa. Let's hear from Frank Talk. Good morning to you.
Morning, Golan. I just want to say this is the greatest gift for Tatu Madiba and many of us. But equally, Golan, you know, like when your best sister or your best daughter get married, there are those mixed feelings. I am equally excited, but at the same time concerned because you're losing or expecting one of your great in cabinet and in terms of turning around Home Affairs. And I just hope the replacement, of Nkosazana Zuma would be as ethical as she was and as hardworking as she was. I hope we do not get one of the people who buy, some photo at McDonald's with a credit card, something like that. So I honestly hope we replace her with one of the best cadres that we could deploy in that department.
All right, Frank talking Mangaung. Dr. Yakisile, let me bring you in that issue because, and we've discussed it with Dr. Landsberg and others, that part of the problem, though, in the run-up to this election is that the South Africans were not taken into the confidence of the leadership. In other words, nobody explained to us what the benefits of taking one of our best ministers out of the cabinet to the continent will be. And that is why then you get a lot of people saying that, well, whilst we congratulate her, but we are worried about what's going to happen then to Home Affairs, for instance. Do you agree?
I do think that she will leave a huge gap in a department that she's managed to turn around. And the domestic issues and it certainly leaves one with some concern because all those skills, the hard work, the passion that she showed in Home Affairs are now going to be applied in the Africa Union. But this is part of a bigger game. In my view, what President Zuma is trying to do and what the South African government is trying to do is, in part, at least, is to position South Africa really, amongst others, for this ambition to become a UN Security Council member, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and to position South Africa globally. Now, if you look at the trends across Africa, then South Africa's relative size and influence in Africa over the longer term is declining. Our relative economic size and so on and so forth is going to be overtaken by countries like Nigeria and eventually down the line even by countries like Ethiopia in the not too distant future. Therefore, if South Africa wants to make a game plan, if we have a game plan for really reaching for big issues like the UN Security Council, we need to do it now. And getting Mrs. Dlamini Zuma in as chair of the African Union certainly is a huge victory for South Africa. It helps to position the country in this broader unfolding game of international diplomacy of where the world is moving to, this multipolar world, and it's a huge achievement for South Africa.
Could I just come in here, please? Because
yes,
I'm
please.
quite frankly baffled, and it's a pity that Clayton is not on the phone any longer. On the one hand, and I just heard it from Yaki Saliers as well. On the one hand, we say this was a SADC candidate, right? Strip away the fact that it is the most industrialized country. It's a SADC victory. On the other hand, we make a direct link between this victory and our foreign policy and the benefits to be had for our foreign policy, the fact that Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma has it. So let me answer Zubaida's question that she asked earlier. She said she was surprised by the skepticism and some of the cynicism as to why we wouldn't support, to quote her, South Africa's position for advancing the African agenda. I put it to you that there are many in African quarters, and to an extent I belong to that school, which actually questions whether we are pushing the African agenda. The worst thing that Dr. Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma could do now is to come across as an executive secretary or a chair of the commission doing the bidding for and taking a cue from Pretoria as opposed to being this uniting force. She must now understand that once this euphoria is now over, that it's a South African that won, that she is the COO for Africa's premier interstate body. It's not an extension of South Africa's foreign policy.
Sure.
And when analysts start to make those links, those are the worrying concerns. But I leave you with this very serious thought. I have my doubts whether we speak on behalf of Africa sometimes. I have my doubts whether what we do in BRICS is to serve Africa's interests or it is to serve our own interests. I have no doubts whether we use our position in the G20 Development Committee to push an African agenda. It is the same South Africa that we're now saying are pushing an African agenda that was soon after Polokwane, because of the nature of what happened in Polokwane and the personalities involved and the fallouts there, that was very uncertain about whether NEPAD is the agenda that it should push. Only recently did we fill Chris Townsend's vacancy with the chair of the ANC to fill that position. So this notion that we are this noble acting in Africa, acting on behalf of Africa and getting everything right, is absolutely not true. It does not have
all right. Well, let me bounce it back to Dr. Cilliers. But what are your thoughts on that? And also, is there a contradiction between our interest and the regional interest? In other words, if we push South Africa's interest, does that necessarily mean that we're not pushing a regional interest, Dr. Cilliers?
Well, Chris raises a number of very important points, and he's correct in my view in most of what he's saying. I think amongst the analytical community there has been confusion and a lack of clarity about the direction of South Africa's foreign policy, because under President Thabo Mbeki we had a foreign policy that really went around African solidarity. The fact that South Africa became a member of the BRICS elevated our ambitions globally. And under President Zuma, South Africa is trying to play in a global league. We were not really part of that league, but we certainly are playing this in that league now. And the fact that Mrs. Dlamini Zuma, as a South African candidate, has succeeded really adds to that luster. And the fact that we could do that against generally the wishes of larger other African countries. So it does reflect upon our relative power and influence, particularly our soft power, because that's where South Africa excels. It's not in our hard power, our military capabilities, but in the quality and competence of our think tanks, our diplomacy, and so on. So I go back to the point that this is a huge achievement for South Africa indirectly. She will not serve South Africa's direct national interests, but it certainly takes us forward in advancing our global ambitions. And I mentioned the issue of UN Security Council, permanent seat, and those type of issues.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me get a closing remark as well from Sanusha Naidu.
Listen, I think it's important for us to also keep in mind that when Mrs. Zuma is at the helm of the AUC and she starts taking on more responsibility and implementing, it's very important to remember that she's dealing with member states. And I think the point about how she actually advances certain issues will definitely come back to ask, is it in the South African interest or is it in the broader interest of the continent? I think if it's one thing to actually anchor our foreign policy and say we're pursuing an African agenda, but we need to be very clear about what that African agenda is beyond rhetoric and platitude. Secondly, I think what's important as well is that it's going to be quite interesting, I think, that as we move into this position, as she becomes much more settled in this position, is that she will have to start thinking about the interests of other countries as well, who will continue to ask the question of her. And I think she'll be under the microscope because being a big power, she'll be constantly looked at in terms of whether or not it's about Pretoria or whether it's about the African Union. And I think in that context, if this is about positioning ourselves regionally, globally, and within the multilateral of the international system, then of course there will be residual issues, and there will be continuous kind of revolving around what is she doing and how is she doing it and what is it about? Is it in the interest of South Africa or not? And I think again, if she doesn't actually do what she says she's going to do and implement the policies and make the AU an effective body, then she could very well end up having another contender as she contended against Mr. Ping. Jeez. And I think that's what we need to be looking out for.
All right. Well, lots to analyze still on this matter. I really thank all my guests for coming through today. Sanusha Naidu, Senior Researcher at the South African Foreign Policy Initiative, as well as Dr. Yakisilia, Executive Director at the Institute for Security Studies, and Dr. Chris Landsberg, Head of Politics at the University of Johannesburg. A little earlier on also we got a call from Addis, from the spokesperson for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. That's Mr. Clayson Munyela. We thank him very much for calling us. We thank the team, though, who put it all together for you today. Our producers, Mesho Shandlale and Wisane Makubele. Technical producer, Patrick Monana. Senior producers, Lungele Mabaso and Chili Titibase. Forum at 8 producer, Jake Mugoma. Chief producer, Bootsilu Koto. Executive producers, Oprah Sechie and Bosi Ichane. My name is Kolane Gwala. I thank you very much for listening to the program. I thank you very much as well for all the input, SMSs, emails, as well as calls today. We shall be doing this again tomorrow 6 to 9 here on SAF. 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 Tomorrow 6 to 9 here